Hello and welcome to Beacon Hill Update with State Senator Jason Lewis. I'm Tom Dalton, Senator Lewis's Communications Director here in the State House, and we're here to talk to you today about some of the news from Beacon Hill and the State House more broadly, and some of the work that Senator Lewis has been doing with his colleagues since the legislative session began in January. So, Senator, I think we'll kick right off. Summertime in the State House is a time where everyone gets really focused on the state budget for the coming year. And the state budget has been signed by the governor, and it's in effect now. So I know there were a lot of really big pieces of policy and funding in the state budget for the coming year, and I'd love to ask you a few questions about the things that were included in the budget, if we could start there.
Definitely, and thanks, Tom, for hosting again another issue of Beacon Hill Update, and it's great to have this chance to give folks in our communities an update on what we've been working on over the last few months.
Great. So I think the first place to start in the budget, given that you're the Senate Chair of the Committee on Education, is education funding. I know there were some pretty major developments in education funding in the state budget this year, so could you give us a snapshot
Definitely.
of what the...
Yeah, I'm really happy with where we landed on education funding in the state budget. That is a very high priority for, definitely for me and really for, I would say, all of my colleagues, in the Senate and the House of Representatives. We really want to do as much as we can to support our local school districts. And we were able to increase funding for what's known as Chapter 70, which is the main way we fund public schools in our state, by the largest increase in more than 20 years. Just a little less than $300 million in new state aid for our schools. And that is really a down payment on the changes that we are working on within the Education Committee to updating and reforming our school funding formula. And so while we're continuing to work on that, and I know we'll talk more about that later in our Beacon Hill Update, we feel a sense of urgency. We don't want to wait, so we were already trying to start making those changes in this year's state budget. So big increase in Chapter 70 funding, which is going to help all of our school districts. And also we fully funded the what's known as the special education circuit breaker, and that helps our school districts with the high costs associated with students that require special services and have to be placed out of the district.
Right. Well, so those are some huge accomplishments that'll probably affect just about every public school in the state. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Both of those are very important, certainly to our communities and our school districts, but really do impact every community across the state.
Great. Well, so I remember from at the beginning of this legislative session when we surveyed constituents about issues that were important to them, education funding was one of the top issues, but another one of the top issues was healthcare affordability. And I know that the state budget did some work on specifically addressing the affordability of prescription drugs. Could you talk a little bit about that, Alan?
Definitely, and you're absolutely right. When we kind of did our online survey of our constituents a few months ago, and we definitely saw that the high cost of health care and the high out-of-pocket costs was a big issue for people, particularly drug costs. So that is something we are working hard to tackle. We have legislation that I'm the lead sponsor of, working with Healthcare for All and various other groups that would take a very comprehensive approach to addressing and reining in high drug costs. And so we're continuing to work on that. But in the meantime, in the state budget, as you mentioned, we took an important step forward within the Mass Health program. So that's our state's Medicaid program. It's a very big part of the state budget, and there's about well over 1 million Massachusetts residents who get their health insurance through Mass Health. So for the first time, we'll be putting new requirements on drug manufacturers and on PBMs, those are the middlemen in the industry, around more transparency of how these prices are set, and also more authority to Mass Health to negotiate over those drug prices, and to, particularly for the drugs that we've seen egregious increases in cost of things like EpiPens and insulin and many other drugs that is making it just so hard for people to afford the medicine they need. So really happy that we've taken a big step forward there, and again, we're going to keep working on this legislation so that we can do this across the whole industry, including private insurance as well.
Terrific. That sounds like a really impactful policy change that should hopefully really affect those drug prices for consumers. Now, on healthcare, while we're staying on the topic of the budget, obviously the state is still really experiencing a very dramatic crisis of addiction and drug overdoses. Now, there have been recent reports that show that overdose deaths are down, but the number of people who are still experiencing substance use disorder and addiction is still very high. There's some funding in the state budget that could help address that in our communities. Isn't that right? Would you?
Yes, definitely. That has been a priority for us for a number of years now, to increase funding for treatment for addiction, also for education and prevention in our schools and our communities. And we're now also focusing more effort on recovery, because we know that addiction is a chronic illness, and that even when somebody is sober, that takes it's very hard to stay clean, and we need to provide services and supports so that people can continue to stay clean. And one of the ways we're able to do that is through addiction recovery centers, they're known as, and they've been very successful. We have a number of them in Massachusetts. So in this budget, we've included funding for up to 5 more addiction recovery centers, and we're very hopeful that one of those will end up being in the city of Malden, and will be able to serve our region. There's a lot of support locally, and there's a lot of work that's been done already in our community with Malden Overcoming Addiction, and with other local organizations and local officials to put a plan together for a recovery center. So we're going to be applying for funding through this the new money in the state budget. We're hopeful that will be a great new resource in our area to support people who are putting their lives back together, and a recovery center can really help them.
That's terrific. Thank you. So many of our viewers will be familiar with the kind of standard schoolhouse rock process of a bill becoming a law. But what people might not be so familiar with is the fact that from time to time, the state budget will actually include pieces of policy that were originally proposed in legislation, and get them going a little faster, a little more immediately, by including it in the larger legislation that covers the annual state budget. So I know that there was a bill that you were working on, Senator, with State Representative Steve Oltrino from Malden, that made its way into the budget. So if you wouldn't mind talking about that a little.
Yeah, so that relates to our work on what's known as the Medicare Savings Plan, and this is a high priority issue for our seniors, particularly for low-income seniors who rely on Medicare, as do almost all seniors, but there are still out-of-pocket costs with Medicare, and for folks who are just getting by, that can be a huge burden. So there is something called the Medicare Savings Plan, which is essentially a federal program, and we've been working for a number of years with Mass Senior Action Council, and Representative Steve Altrino, as you mentioned, has been leading the charge in the House. I've been leading the charge in the Senate to basically expand the eligibility criteria for the Medicare Savings Program. So in other words, more seniors would be able to get help. And we were thrilled that this was included in the state budget, as you said, and so now it's law. And this means that as many as 40,000 more low-income seniors, including in our communities and across the state, will now be getting additional help with affording their medications and other Medicare services, health services that they need.
That's incredible. Congratulations on having that included. Now, in the same way that we could never talk about personal finances without talking about putting a little money away for a rainy day, the state budget also includes some space to save money for an economic rainy day in case the Commonwealth needs it later. So could you talk a little bit about the state stabilization fund and what the budget does for that?
Yeah, so I'm glad you raised that as well, because one thing that a lot of folks don't necessarily understand is that that we, as a state, we have to run a balanced budget every year. It's not like the federal government, where we can run a deficit and just print money or borrow money. Our incoming revenues have to match our expenses every year. So we have to prepare for the possibility that we could have a downturn in the economy. We hope not. We hope we'll continue to have a strong economy and full employment. But we know from history that probably at some point we could go into another recession, and we want to be ready for that. So when our revenues decline in a recession, we don't want to have to cut spending for schools and for roads and for health care coverage. So that's why it's really important that we have a very well-funded rainy day fund or stabilization account. So in this budget, we were able to put almost $500 million, sock that away in our rainy day fund for the state. And now we're slightly over $3 billion rainy day fund, which is a pretty healthy balance, and we've been working hard to build that up over really since the last recession. So that will help give us a cushion, if we have a downturn in the economy in the years to come.
Excellent, thank you. Now we're just over 6 months into the legislative session. The legislature runs on 2-year legislative sessions in which all of the different work of making laws and new policies happens. So with just over 6 months into the session, I know that some of your priorities, some of your legislative proposals have been addressed, and there's been progress in other areas. So if we could kind of pivot away from the budget and talk about some of the legislation that's been passed and some of the legislation that people might expect in the future. I know that last month there was a bill that you filed pertaining to ghost networks that was passed and signed into law. So if you could talk a little bit about the problem that bill was designed to address and what the bill's going to do.
Yeah, so that was a bill that we filed this session that seeks to address a specific problem that people are encountering, which relates to lists of healthcare providers that are supposedly within a person's health network, health insurance network. And then when they go to try to reach providers, find that it in fact is a ghost network, that where the term comes from, because there are providers that are listed that are have relocated, are closed, are no longer taking new patients, don't provide the services anymore, and so people it can be extremely frustrating, and also can in some cases delay access to care because folks are having a hard time finding providers. Now this is a particularly acute problem when it comes to mental health care. And that's where I've heard about it from a lot of our constituents. So we filed this legislation, requires insurers to keep these networks of providers up to date, go through a regular process so that you don't have ghost networks. We've been working with consumer groups and the insurers to sort of get them on board, and I was very pleased that the state Senate took up the bill and passed it. We are actually still waiting for the House to take it up, so it's not law yet. But I know the House is talking about also addressing this issue, so I'm pretty optimistic that this could get all the way to the governor's desk.
Great. Now, something that was addressed by both the House and the Senate earlier this year was your proposal to revive what's been called the Fair Share Amendment, which is an amendment to the Massachusetts Constitution. Could you speak a little bit about the amendment and the kind of process that we need to go through here in the State House to get that amendment in front of the voters for their approval?
Sure, yeah. So for those who may have forgotten about this, it's known as the Fair Share Amendment. It's also sometimes referred to as the millionaire's tax. It was going to be on the ballot last year for the voters to weigh in on, but unfortunately there was a legal challenge, and so it was not, it could not move forward. But we have resurrected it, and essentially it's the same proposal. It would be a 4% additional income tax on annual income over $1 million a year. So only for those households that have more than $1 million in income, this would be a modest additional increase in income tax. It is not, it's not a wealth tax. It's not based on the value of your house or your investments. And the money would have to be used to help fund our schools, make higher education more affordable, and also could be used for roads and bridges and public transit. So really, really important needs. So we have revived that, and it went through the first major milestone, which was a combined session of the House and the Senate. It's called a Constitutional Convention, and we debated and voted on it, and it got 70% support, more than 70% support of state reps and senators. So that's great news. So what has to happen now is it's going to be voted on again next legislative session, and then if it's successful again, which I anticipate it will be, then it will be on the ballot in 2022. So 2.5 years from now for the voters to make the final decision. And that's really, if that's successful, that will really help us a lot in supporting some very critical needs that we have in our schools: higher education, early education, and transportation.
Great, and I think just about everyone in the state would agree that education and transportation are such critically important areas, and so finding new revenues to support those investments really is so important. Now, on the topic of transportation, there was also a lot of discussion in the last couple months about a bill related to distracted driving, and I know that that's not quite over the finish line to be signed by the governor yet. But could you talk a little bit about the distracted driving legislation and where it stands now?
Yeah, so everyone's aware of the big, really epidemic we have with drivers who are using their phones, texting, reading emails while they're driving, and it's it really is causing a lot more accidents and even fatalities on our roadways. So, although we already have a law against texting while driving, it's been difficult for police officers to enforce that. So the Senate has passed several times now legislation basically to require, to prohibit any use of cell phones while driving other than in hands-free mode. And the good news is that the House of Representatives earlier this year also passed similar legislation. So what's happening now is we are negotiating between the House and the Senate to finalize the legislation because we need to work out a few small differences between the version the House passed and the version the Senate passed. So that's ongoing right now, but I expect when in the fall they will reach final agreement, and then that legislation will be sent to Governor Baker, and he's already said that he plans to sign it. So
great.
I would say by this fall we'll have a law that will basically say, hey, you can't use your cell phone or other device while you're driving, except if it's in hands-free mode, and that should hopefully make our roads quite a bit safer for drivers and pedestrians and cyclists.
Right. Well, that'll be a big change for the people that we've all seen driving down the street with their phone in hand, but it seems like a really great public safety improvement. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you are the Senate chair of the Joint Committee on Education, and education funding especially has been a huge topic of discussion on Beacon Hill and around the state for many years now, but especially this year. Could you give us a little insight into the work you're doing as chair of the Education Committee on funding and what people might expect in the coming months?
Definitely. So the Education Committee, which, as you said, I'm proud to be the Senate chair, we have been working hard this year to look at all aspects of our school finance system. We've been touring around the state, to talk with with teachers and with students and superintendents and principals, parents, to really understand a lot of the challenges that our schools are facing, whether they're urban districts, suburban districts, rural districts. And we are preparing legislation in the Education Committee. We've made a lot of progress in the last several months, and we're very hopeful we'll be releasing that bill shortly after Labor Day. And that bill would be the most significant update to our school funding system, school finance, in at least a decade. And very hopeful that that legislation will then be successful and get through the process. And if so, it will make a huge difference in providing greater resources for our school districts, which have been really struggling over the last number of years. And as I mentioned earlier, we are not waiting for that legislation to pass. We already made changes in the state budget this year, so we're starting to see the impact of these, changing the formula, providing more Chapter 70 aid for our schools. But it's very important that we do get this legislation passed so that this is then permanent, and all of our school districts and our communities, will know what they can expect going forward. So that's a top priority for me, for the committee. It's also a top priority for the Senate President and the leadership in the House, and for Governor Baker as well. So we're committed to this. Very hopeful, as I said, we'll be able to get legislation, moving forward in the fall, and hopefully finish this year.
Great, that's really exciting, and I'm sure people in the community will be following those developments very carefully. Now, obviously, you're education chairman for a whole legislative session here, and there'll be many other issues I'm sure that the committee will take up. Are there any other issues related to education that you're particularly interested in following as the session continues?
There's definitely, but funding's the big one right now, and we want to get that done. But other issues we're looking at, include certainly issues around what's known as breakfast after the bell, which is making sure that all kids can get to school and are ready to learn, which means that they need to make sure that they have breakfast and access to nutritious meals. So there's a program called Breakfast After the Bell, which we've been rolling out in our schools, and we want to keep pursuing that and supporting that, and that's been very successful. Also, what's known as the Healthy Youth Act, which relates to making sure that kids have the health curriculum is up to date and age appropriate and evidence-based in terms of covering all the bases on health education. We're working on some legislation there. Also, very eager to expand what we do for early education and childcare. We know a lot of families are struggling there as well, and want to make sure that we have access to affordable childcare, and then early education, kicking in at 3 years old, 4 years old, and ways that we can increase access to affordable early ed is a top priority as well, certainly for me, and for I know for many others on Beacon Hill and out in the community.
Terrific. Well, thank you, Senator Lewis, for taking the time to provide this Beacon Hill update today. I'm sure that the viewers at home appreciate it, but of course, if viewers at home have any questions or they'd like to get in touch with our office for any other questions or concerns or priorities, we're always available by email at jason.lewis@masenate.gov, and we're always available by phone at 617-722-1206.
Except today, of course, when the phone lines at the State House are down, right, because of a construction accident.
Absolutely.
Although hopefully that'll be fixed soon, and
and
we'll
by the time this airs, hopefully we'll be able to receive phone calls.
Right, we hope
but
so.
At any rate, you can always reach us by email, and we're also Senator Lewis is very active on social media at Senator Jason Lewis on all the major platforms.
And office hours too, right?
Right, of course.
Another option, and we have office hours each month in each community, and where anyone's welcome to stop by, just call us or check out our website for the times for office hours.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Senator, again, for taking the time today, and hopefully some of the members of the public will follow up with us with some more questions and ideas as you continue your work this legislative session.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, and thanks to everyone for watching. And again, we really welcome your feedback, your questions for us, your concerns. Don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you.
Thanks.